Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. On behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al Ali, CEO of Trends Group, welcome to the 14th Trends Strategic Dialogue. Our past 13 sessions available on our website and social media platforms have brought global experts together to analyze the war in the Middle East. Today, we focus on the war in the Middle East, navigating US policy amid regional escalation. We meet at a highly sensitive moment. The region is facing rapid changes, rising tensions, and shifting alliances, especially following the difficult reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and ongoing efforts to contain the conflict. This instability is no longer just local. It reflects deeper changes in the global order. At the center of this is US policy, which still plays a major role in shaping regional balances and managing escalations. Today, Washington faces a tough balancing act. It wants to protect its interests, secure allies, and safeguard global energy markets. However, it faces challenges from non-state actors and rising regional powers, which makes traditional tools for peace less effective. This raises critical questions. Can the US still guarantee regional stability? And is its policy aimed to managing the conflict or to reshape the region entirely? To answer these questions, we're honored to welcome a distinguished group of experts in Middle Eastern affairs and US foreign policy. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward for an engaging discussion.
Thank you, Hamdan. Appreciate it. Absolutely delighted to serve as a moderator of this conversation for the next, let's just say, 80 minutes or so. I'll be also taking a few questions from the audience. Well, maybe I should introduce myself. My name is Bilal Saab. I'm the Senior Managing Director of Trends US, which is the Washington, D.C. office of Trends. So we're doing this sort of as a collaboration here. It certainly helps that the speakers are all friends of mine. I have great admiration for their scholarship, their intellect. So I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we can start the conversation because we have a lot to cover. Someone I owe my career to, Ken Pollack, dear friend, and currently serving as the Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute, served at the National Security Council twice in the past, focusing on the Gulf and the broader Middle East. A number of books under his belt. Danny Pletka, also a dear friend of mine, currently serving as a senior fellow distinguished at the American Enterprise Institute. Previously was a senior professional staff member at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, long and distinguished career as well. Stephen Cook, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, certainly an authority on all things Middle East, and an author of a number of award-winning books on the Middle East. He's also a columnist with Foreign Policy. Last but not least, my former colleague at the Pentagon, Annie Dreesen, 15 years in the Pentagon. So she paid her dues, and now she is the Vice President for the Center for the Middle East at the American Jewish Council. With that, like I said, lots to cover, and I'm always confronted with the challenge whenever I go on TV, frankly, just better educate myself about what the hell is going on, because the situation is incredibly fluid, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and I just keep repeating myself about I don't know. So why don't we just start with a basic situational awareness about where we are today, especially in light of what happened last night with the attacks on Kuwait. Let me start with Stephen. Stephen, how do you see the current stalemate? How close are we to some kind of an agreement between the United States and Iran? What is the progress that's been made? What are the remaining challenges?
Well, thanks, Bilal, and thanks for the kind invitation and the kinder introduction. Only one book won an award. I wish others had, and I think they deserve them, but only one did. Just to set the record straight. Look, I think you used the operative word here, and it's a stalemate. I think that there's been a lot of noise and a lot of speculation, particularly in Washington, about where we are, where we're going. It seems every 3 days there is an alert that we're close to some sort of deal, and we never seem to be any closer to it. And I think what's interesting is The narrative is either the president is desperate for a deal and is looking for the least humiliating way out of this, yet he keeps sending back to the Iranians two or three things that have been consistent all along. One, no enrichment, and the Strait of Hormuz has to be open for freedom of navigation. And it makes me wonder. Again, I think in general there is a sense that the president, who has said that the negotiations are boring, and that the president believed that this conflict would have long been over by now had he found his Persian version of Delcy Rodriguez. But at the same time, he seems to be hanging tough on a number of issues. And it makes me wonder whether he believes that the run-up in gas prices in the United States, the inflationary effect that has on other things, is a shorter-term problem, and that he believes that he's close to forcing the collapse of the Iranian economy and thus perhaps the regime. That is counter to, I think, the dominant narrative here in Washington, that the president is desperate to get out anything that he'll do. And the alleged drafts of agreements that have been reported on by Barak Ravid and the AP and so on and so forth would suggest that he's been more forthcoming. But each time we get a report on what this memo of this MOU looks like, he says no, no enrichment. They've got to give up the highly enriched uranium and freedom of navigation in the Strait. So again, that leads to a stalemate because the Iranians believe that they have time on their hands, and that our politics and the midterm elections will ultimately force the president's hand. In the meantime, we do have violence, which is apparently under the threshold of a ceasefire violation, happening fairly regularly. So that is my understanding of the way things go. If you ask me what I think the president's decision-making is here, that's a much harder thing to discern, especially with the kind of torrent of Truth Social posts that say one thing or another. But in general, I think the outline is a stalemate. And for all of our talk about Taco, Trump always caves. He's hanging tough on enrichment and freedom of navigation so far.
Fair enough. And I realize this is really hard to assess the type of progress that's been made because of the very uncertain information environment, right? This is sort of an unusual situation, and the very nature of the relationship between the administration and the media, right? So I guess the primary source, as you said yourself, Stephen, for us is the Truth Social post of the president. And then from there, try to make inferences and guesses as to how this thing is going. But just generally speaking, and I'm not going to hold you accountable to it, are you in a position to say that we're getting closer to a deal or not really?
I put me in the not really camp. I would just say that there are expectations that are well beyond what we actually know and well beyond anything that I think is possible. Way back in mid-April, people are expecting the Strait to be open in a matter of days, and I said this is going to be months before the Strait of Hormuz is open. So I don't think we're close. And now I've become so inured to these these posts by journalists with the siren saying breaking and we have an agreement and we're close to an agreement. With all due respect to people who are my friends who report on these things, my response to that is just call me when it actually happens. I refuse to get spun up about these things until it actually happens.
Fair enough. Okay. Danny, I know it's unfair to make any definitive judgments about how the United States is faring in this conflict because it's just not over yet. I know a lot of people have rushed to the conclusion that we've lost the war, Iran has won, and so on and so forth. I mean, they haven't even started negotiating whenever they do sign the MOU. But having said that, just in terms of prosecution of this conflict, in terms of performance, I'm not going to ask you to give a scorecard, but at least just give us your own evaluation, your own assessment of how the United States is doing in this ongoing crisis with Iran.
Thank you, Bilal. So I agree with everything Stephen just said. Yes, indeed. Yes, I do. And I think that when you look at, let's say, the situation thus far, right? So up to now, understanding we have absolutely no idea what's going on. It's not just that we have no idea what's going on. It is that the president of the United States actually says different things that are inherently contradictory, often several times a day. But I think that this conflict tracks a lot like most recent U.S. conflicts. In other words, military has done very well. Military operations are good. They have hit what they needed to. They have taken out what they needed to. They have devastated what they needed to. And where they have performed in ways that are coming under criticism. Why didn't we take the Strait? Why didn't we do more about Iran's missiles? I would say in 95% of those cases, the military's shortcomings have nothing to do with their military plans, with the material we have, with our competent commander in the region, in the AOR, and everything to do with the president, commander-in-chief. Now, we're big believers in civil control of the military. I am also a big believer in that. On the other hand, when you have a president who says, stop, go, stop, go, stop, go, it's hard to have an operation that anybody can look at and say, wow, they're really killing it. So I think that, I think that the Admiral Cooper's testimony before Congress a couple of weeks ago summed it up nicely. I think we've devastated Iran's military defense infrastructure. I think they are economically in a death spiral. I think all of our military goals, insofar as they have been articulated clearly by the president, are largely met. The problem is the peace. The problem is the ceasefire. The president seems incapable of deciding what to do. The president seems to at once believe the lies that are being told to him by Steve Witkoff, and to believe the contradictory points that are being confided to him by members of Congress. Now, so the Iranians are totally in my hands. He says stuff like that. And then, of course, the Iranians walk away from the negotiations. And then the president says, and here 5 minutes later, the Iranians have agreed to give up their nuclear weapon and never have one. And the Iranians say, no, we haven't. So I guess the last point I would make about this is that the president definitely looks weak. The United States looks weak. The United States looks incapable of making a decision. The United States looks like it has very little judgment or inherent understanding of how Iran works. And the Iranians feel that they are so much in control that they can now leverage the president's own negotiators against Benjamin Netanyahu in Lebanon, right? And that they can do so via strategic and false, I should add, leaks about what the president may or may not have said in conversations with the prime minister of Israel. And so, again, the Iranians feel like things are going their way. It's hard to argue that things are going their way when their currency is worth close to nothing, when they are not selling oil, when they are not exporting, when they are not importing, when they have absolutely no money and not a whole deal of control, and the president reportedly wants to resign because he's pissed off. On the other hand, any of this could change. I don't know, while we're talking, we could just start bombing Iran. And none of us who are all expert in this, and all of us who are profoundly experienced in Washington, and some of us who know the president will be able to tell you when that's going to happen, if that's going to happen, or how that's going to happen. That's the sum up of the situation.
Yeah. Ken, I think we've been all trained to, not exactly a rosy picture. Ken, I think we've all been trained to respect quite a good bit any words coming out of the mouth of the commander in chief, right? They typically represent policy. Except to Danny's point, it's really hard to have the same level of respect for the words of the president because of the inherent contradictions and the just lack of clarity and cohesion in everything he's saying. So this once again might be unfair of a way to judge the performance of the United States in this crisis. But you remember how we started with pre-war aims of unconditional surrender, and where we ended up with current realities with an Iranian regime that is probably more cohesive, more radical, still has significant military capabilities and some control over the Strait of Hormuz. And oh, by the way, still with the ability to enrich. So if you just look at that staggering contrast, pre-war, during the war, isn't it fair to say that we're not doing so well? And you are muted, my friend.
God.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. It's only been 6 years since we've been using Zoom. I'll put it this way, Paul. To both Stephen and Danny's terrific points, I think you can make a case that we are winning, but we may not win. Right? And that's the ultimate problem, is that if the war were to end right now, we will not have won. Because exactly as Stephen and Danny have pointed out, we've done a great deal of damage to Iran. But if Iran is allowed to remain control of the Strait of Hormuz, or to remain with the capacity to close the Strait of Hormuz when it chooses to do so, and let's also add to that, very closely related point, but we need to recognize it is a separate point. If Iran also believes at the end of this war that it can threaten the Gulf states whenever it chooses to do so, with ballistic missile launches, with drone attacks, and can do so in a way that will be unacceptable to the Gulf states, right? That too will constitute a loss for the United States. That will leave the United States and its allies worse off than we were at the beginning of this operation. Second point, as you kind of pointed out, we have a very big problem, both as analysts watching it, and of course, I think it's even worse for average folks who don't have our years of expertise on the subject. But as Danny is pointing out, it's just as problematic in terms of the conduct of the negotiations, which is that unfortunately, all of the actors have only a very tenuous relationship with the truth. Okay, President Trump lies all the time. As Danny has suggested, there are real reasons to believe that his subordinates may be lying to him. The Iranians lie all the time, right? And we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. The U.S. media is so determined to catch the president in falsehoods that they often seem to accept the Iranians at their words. And sometimes, occasionally, the Iranians do say exactly what they're thinking or say the truth, but again, they lie endlessly. And so even when they're telling the truth, it is hard for someone who does not have outside information or understanding of them to know what is actually real. And again, this makes it hard to follow the conflict, but as Danny's pointing out, really importantly, it makes it also hard for the participants themselves to actually know what's going on, right? There is this constant problem of who are we negotiating with? Are the people we are negotiating with people actually representative of the Iranian government to the extent that there actually is one? Can any deal that is signed be something that the Iranians will act upon? And by the way, let's also add that so much of this is being done through third-party interlocutors such as the Pakistanis, and other people have raised real doubts as to whether those third-party interlocutors are being truthful and passing the messages accurately back and forth to either side. Last point I think that's worth thinking about, and again, both Danny and Stephen's points were kind of getting at this, and it's something important for us to think about, which is that right at the moment we are caught in a stalemate. I would even use as a important American academic named Bill Zartman, who coined this term, a herding stalemate. He didn't mean it about this kind of a circumstance, but I think it applies very nicely. Both sides are hurting.
The question is, who is going to cry uncle first? Both seem determined, at least so far, not to do so. But even if this war were to end with an American victory, and by God, I hope it does, and I think that that would have to come through the Iranians ultimately deciding that they were taking too much pain and not able to exert as much on the United States, because let's recognize the alternatives that the United States has make massive concessions or massive military escalation, both terrible. So we need this strategy to work. But even if it does work, at the end of it, what we need to recognize is that we're kind of in a very different ballpark when it comes to Middle East wars. This is much more of a kind of an Israeli kind of a war, which is problematic in and of itself for the United States. The Israelis have decided their enemies will never rest, and they will never be allowed to win decisive victories over them. And so they've coined this term mowing the grass. Just periodically, we're going to have to win narrow victories that simply buy us a little more time. That's not what the American people are accustomed to when it comes to war fighting. The American people are accustomed to and look for decisive victories. And when this war ends, it's going to be hard to make the case that we've won a decisive victory. At best, we're going to have mowed the lawn. And that, I think, is going to be an important thing for us to think about moving forward.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. Annie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, there's clear consensus, at least among this group, that we've showed tactical brilliance throughout this war, and we've made some important strategic, tactical accomplishments, but strategically speaking, we have fallen short. Would you agree with that? What could you add to what you've heard from our colleagues?
Thank you so much, Bilal, for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with so many friends and esteemed colleagues on this panel. I think it's too soon to give a final score on this. I think we are still very much in the midst of this, and that there's going to be some time. And part of the reason why I think this we're not going to have an answer to this too quickly is because the test is really going to be for President Trump, whether the outcomes of this conflict, whether he can take to the people, to the American people, a narrative that can be persuasive to the American people, explaining that the outcomes of this decision to go to war put the United States in a better place than it was on February 27th. Is Iran more constrained now than it was on February 27th? Is the region more secure? Are our partners reassured? At this specific moment right now, we're not there. But I think this really gets to the heart of why President Trump is not taking these ceasefire agreements yet, and why he keeps going back. Because on the one hand, he has the pressure dealing with the oil prices, the strong desire to get a ceasefire in place so that the economy can get back on track, so that we can have a good environment from his perspective leading up to the midterms. But he also recognizes that he needs to take that political win back. And the Iranians are not giving that to him right now. And so I share the perspective of a lot of the people on this panel. And I think we are very much in the midst of this. And the Iranians keep doing things that I think make it more difficult for the president to accept a ceasefire, and which is very interesting in and of itself. So I think time will really tell. And of course, in this sort of conflict, it's only what determines winning is only the very final. The final battle. It's not the beginning and it's not the middle. So we'll see.
Perfect. Thank you, Annie. Stephen, even though we're not giving grades here, but I will give an A+ to your background and your library behind you. That is pretty sweet. Stephen, one day this war is going to end. We don't know when. Okay. We don't know how. But just in your estimate, how will it impact, how will it shape our long-term position in the Middle East? Or do you feel like no matter how this ends, we've already made up our minds about what we want to do with that part of the world, regardless of the outcome of this crisis? And you are also muted, my friend. There
Yeah, and I wasn't going to mute myself because I wouldn't want to have the Ken problem. And then I was like, well, I'll remember. Ken's a bit older than me. I'll remember to do it. And then, of course, I forgot. I'm sorry. I think the question, the real answer to the question is predicated on what the outcome is. As Ken pointed out, we're winning, but we haven't yet won. And I think and so if we win, that'll imply a different kind of change to the region than if we don't win, or we come to this indeterminate outcome where we're put in this position where we've gained a whole slew of tactical victories, but the job is quote unquote not yet finished, and the Iranians retain the ability to either control or partially control the strait, or to physically threaten our partners on the other side of the Gulf, which will imply a very different kind of region. Let me step back for a second and say we've been arguing about this region and what we want in this region for quite some time, for the better part of the last 2 or 3 decades. And we were going to transform it. And then we pulled back from transforming it, and we were going to turn away from it and pivot to Asia. We weren't going to do that, but we were going to not tell people how to live their lives any longer. We were going to have a lighter footprint. And I think the president was in Riyadh a year ago and made actually a very good speech along these lines. Even his toughest critics said it was a very good speech. And then suddenly we are heavily invested in this conflict, which, again, I don't believe the president believed would go on for as long as it has. But here we are. And so I think that the most likely outcome here is indeterminate. And so what we're likely to see is a weakened but empowered Iran all at the same time. That's assuming that some months down the road, the Iranian people don't actually rise up. And I think that after Operation Midnight Hammer and Rising Lion, there was this false narrative in Washington created by people who were who opposed both of those things, to say, oh, look, the Iranians are rallying around the flag, when that was a creation of the Iranian regime, that Iranians were rallying around the flag. And then Iranians did rise up for primarily economic reasons, but put the regime at jeopardy in ways that it hadn't been before. So there's always the possibility that Iranian people will come out and take matters into their own hands. People forget that the Iranian Revolution unfolded over the course of 15, 18 months, where protest waxed and waned throughout that period. But all things being equal, if we're looking at a sort of indeterminate outcome, I think that our position of undertaking this war without a decisive strategic victory puts our partners in an awkward place. And I think it puts them in different places. It strikes me that the Emiratis will look to tighten their relationship with the United States, along with a tightening of their relationship with Israel. The Saudis less convinced that the United States isn't an agent of chaos in the region, drawing closer to Turkey, Qatar, Pakistan. The Omanis generally being frozen out at this point, and the Kuwait is somewhat shaky. The Bahrainis looking to follow the Emiratis and seeing the benefits of those the relationships that they've had all before. I think the idea that we have operated and policymakers have operated with, and I'm the only one on this panel who hasn't served in government, but it's been very clear that policymakers have looked at the region and said there is a regional political order that is led by the United States, and that includes Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, the other small Qatar, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, and virtually Israel, and since 2020, not virtually Israel. That regional order may not hold as a result of this conflict. And you'll see different camps. Like I pointed out, you'll see the Emiratis, Israelis, the United States, Greeks, Cypriots, Somaliland, my new favorite country, Saudi, Qatar, Turkey, Pakistan. We're going to see a fracturing of this, and how to best manage the challenge associated with a greatly weakened but necessarily empowered Iran if things essentially unfold along the way that they have now. It's hard to believe that we're going to do that. And like I said in my opening remark, the president seems to be hanging tough on a number of issues. But even on those, if those issues are resolved, it doesn't necessarily suggest strategic victory for the United States. I mean, if the president is able to somehow reestablish freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, we're just going back to the status quo ante of February 27th. Yep. And not the kind of change that he sought as a result when he launched Operation Epic Fury.
Fair enough. Danny, a two-part question to you. What do you think this administration, what do you think this president is willing to live with when it comes to Iran, assuming that the unconditional surrender is not going to happen? Okay, so there's got to be some trade-offs, some things that we might have to agree to grudgingly. What do you think is the bare minimum? And the second part is, what do you feel like we should be living with beyond what the administration is willing to live with?
President will live with the opening of the strait and some facade that suggests that the Iranians have given up their nuclear weapons ambitions that is less than the complete and total removal by the United States of all of their military nuclear material, which is what he had been demanding, Libya style, right? So I think that's what he'll end up with, because all the people who suggested to me that the president would get bored with this, and I said, oh no, he's never going to get bored with this. Yeah, he got bored with it. What should we be doing? We should overthrow the Iranian regime. We should execute the plan that was in place at the beginning. We should empower the Iranian people. We should, I know Ken's going to love this part, we should give weapons to all of the separatists inside Iran as was planned. We should continue to bomb the living daylights out of them. We should take control of Hajj and all of the other islands in the strait, and then ask the Iranians how they like it, and see what happens then. That's what I think we should do. We still may yet do that. President understands that that's an option for him. It has been presented to him, but so far he's not there. I want to put a couple of caveats in for people, because I think that one of the things that we tend to hear from reporters a lot, actually, and analysts who don't really know what they're talking about, of which there are vast numbers, although not on this webinar, of course, is that President is feeling pressure for the midterms. President is not feeling pressure on the midterms. Not to engage in Washington-centric Beltway talk, but if the president was worried about the midterms, he would have endorsed John Cornyn, a sitting senator from Texas, member of the Republican leadership in the Senate, and not his opponent, who is a deeply flawed candidate, not a Nazi, we should add, not a member of Al-Qaeda, but still a deeply flawed candidate. He doesn't care about the midterms. This is not what he cares about. He cares about himself and his legacy. There's another point. The president cares profoundly about gas prices. No, he doesn't. People around the president care about gas prices, right? J.D. Vance cares about gas prices. Marco Rubio may or may not care about gas prices. Republicans in Congress care about gas prices. Donald Trump does not care about gas prices. And I think this is another really important thing that we need to write off as one of the factors that is influencing his thinking. What he wants is something he can say is victory. And that is the bottom line. May I also just make a comment about what Steve said? Because I think that we don't.
Only if it's nice.
It is nice, as usual, because I love you and everything you do. Well, most everything you do. The decisions that are being made in the region right now are really interesting. And one of the things that many of us said after the signing of the JCPOA was that the JCPOA and Barack Obama explicitly gave the region and the powers in the region license to make decisions for themselves. Don't talk to us. Don't consult with us. You feel like you need to invade Yemen? You do you. And not only that, we love you. We'll help you. Right? I think the evidence shows that our friends, particularly in Riyadh, when allowed to make decisions on their own without consulting with us, make really stupid decisions. And that doesn't mean I'm, on Team Emirates or Team Saudi or in the spat that we're not talking about anymore. But it does suggest that we will go through a period of stupid decision-making in the coming years in the wake of this conflict that will, dare I say, inevitably bring us back to the region for yet another eminently predictable and yet difficult to win conflict. And that is something we should be talking about more, because how these powers are positioning themselves now, and particularly I'd love to hear what Steve has to say about, the Saudi-Turkish alliance, which is possibly the dumbest thing since deciding that Al-Qaeda was a really, really good option to support. I'd love to think about that, because I think that is more predictable than what the president and the Iranians are going to do tomorrow, even today.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me just add something that feeds into the thinking. We can address, Turkey and Saudi at another webinar, but let me just say that when President Obama gave regional powers that license and said, you do, then we turned on them and said, all of this is your fault. You're creating chaos. And we didn't listen to them. They said, the Houthis are fanatics and they're not good people. And we engaged in this clothing rending about what was going on in Yemen when the Saudis arguably were just supporting the internationally recognized government there. And we left them in the lurch, which is why they don't believe it when we say that we're committed to their security. And why when the Biden administration said, we are committed to security, the Saudis said, oh yeah, write it down. I don't blame them for that. Write it down because we don't trust you. And it strikes me, they're interpreting the current situation that they're in right now as one in which the United States, our primary strategic partner, is an agent of chaos, and its primary strategic partner adds to that, and we're looking for other options.
Yeah. Okay.
And there you have Turkey, Pakistan, others.
Right. Thank you, Stephen. Ken, before I go to you, Danny, I can't help but ask you this because you mentioned something really interesting, and I love your bluntness, which is why I'd like to involve you in all of my stuff. When the idea of regime change was presented to the president, if you recall, in one of the Situation Room meetings, the CIA director was not very enthusiastic about it. And he had some colorful language about it. Do you feel like that might change down the road, just like what you just said, that nothing is really fixed about U.S. policy?
So first of all, it's really important to know that a lot of what you read that happened in the Situation Room, like a lot of what you read happened on the telephone with the president, didn't actually happen. Okay? That's number one. I would say that Ratcliffe, who, unlike our previous DNI or apparently our new DNI, is actually a pretty serious guy and a good director of Central Intelligence, is always going to be informed by the attitude of the intelligence community. The attitude of the intelligence community is never do anything, right? Because it'll all end up in a mess. And then we will go back and we will find every moment where we told you that it was going to end badly, and we'll leak it to the New York Times or the Washington Post. And it doesn't matter if we told you in the interim that that was a really good idea, or yeah, Iran has a nuclear weapons program, or wow, Iran has a missile program that can reach Diego Garcia, or any of those things. Something they, by the way, didn't tell anybody because, you know, they didn't know. And so, you know, I would take these things with a very, very heavy, few grains of salt. Is the IC ever going to change his mind? No, of course not. You know, I think that one of the things, and Ken is always nicer about this than I am. One of the things about the intelligence community is that outsiders do not perceive, or people who've never had a security clearance don't perceive, is that they are a giant politicized bureaucracy, just like the State Department, just like the military, just like everything else, only they're not following orders like the military. The same is true in the UK, the same is true in Australia, the same is true in France, the same is true in Germany. And so, you know, they may change their mind, they may say something positive about overthrowing the regime in Iran, but the odds are that left to their own devices, they're always going to be against it because they're against everything good and smart, and frankly, they're not very good at what they do anymore.
All right. Well, Ken, I'm not going to ask you to burn bridges with the place where you spent half your life, but let me leverage your military expertise. I mean, this war clearly has revealed a bunch of lessons that will, one way or another, affect what Stephen was talking about, our long-term position in the Middle East. So help us understand how this war will affect at least our defense posture in the Middle East moving forward.
Sure. And I think it is a really important, interesting question. And obviously, we need to bring in things like the Ukraine war as well, because that's also critically important as we think about future warfare. I'll make a couple of points. First, what we've seen in this war, as we've also seen in Ukraine, is a democratization of warfare. And Americans immediately, instinctively think democratization is a good thing. It's not. Okay, especially not when it comes to warfare. Because what we're talking about is lots and lots of actors who now have access to military capabilities that they couldn't have dreamed of in the past. Right? So the proliferation of cheap drones, the proliferation of ballistic missiles, the proliferation of cyber capabilities, right? This is all ongoing, and it means that all kinds of actors who really had no prayer of inflicting damage on a country like the United States of America now can do so. Right. The Israelis, mounted a marvelous operation against Hezbollah in 2024. Now they're seeing Hezbollah start to regain its ability to inflict pain on Israel in ways that just didn't exist in 2024. And that, again, speaks to that democratization, because countries can now, groups can now build capabilities on the fly moving forward. And so what we're talking about here is a narrowing of the gap between the best countries, the best, most capable militaries in the world, and the least capable in the world. Second point, there are still capabilities that can defeat these democratizing weapon systems and capabilities out there, but they're getting more and more and more expensive, right? And this is something that we're coming up against in this war. Yes, Patriots and THAADs and arrows can absolutely shoot down this stuff, but they are really, really expensive. Okay? And that too is, creating changes out there that people haven't completely come to grips with. A third point, and related to this, during the industrial age of warfare, what really mattered in war were the big platforms, tanks, fighter aircraft, warships. These things were very, very hard to operate. And again, it's what made certain countries, us, the Israelis, the Germans, God help us, very good at war fighting. We're moving into an arena or an era of information age warfare where what matters are not the platforms, but the munitions. Right? And the problem with the munitions is that you don't have to be really, really good to operate the munitions. You can buy munitions off the shelf, and if the Chinese and Russians are willing to sell them to you, the Europeans are willing to sell them to you, and of course we're selling to all kinds of people, you can buy weapons that you actually don't have to be very good to use very, very well. Right? And that too is very problematic. And where it comes with the Middle East is that it is transforming what had been a very stable because it was an incredibly lopsided military balance into one that is very unstable because, as I said, the gap is narrowing and actual military capabilities are unclear. Right? For 75 years, we and the Israelis were the best militaries in the Middle East by far. And while it did take most of the Arab states about 25 years to figure it out, and of course, Saddam Hussein never got the memo, but the rest of them figured out, you know what? This whole using military force to try to achieve foreign policy aims doesn't work for us. And they stopped doing it. And it seems strange to say, but that made actually for a very stable military balance in the Middle East, which then underpinned a relatively stable geopolitics of the region. One of the things that we have seen, especially since 2023, has been a whole group of countries that now can't calculate the military balance accurately, with countries believing that and groups believing that they are stronger than they are. That was, a critical element of Hamas's decision to mount the October 7 attacks against Israel. It was a critical element of Iran's decision to pile on and have Hezbollah and the Houthis and the Hashd-e-Shaabi all pile on board because they believed that they were stronger than they were. And lots of groups and countries have learned lesson, but unfortunately, what the Iranians and their axis of resistance have learned is not, we were weaker than it turned out. We thought we were, therefore we shouldn't do this again. It was in that moment, we were. But because of the democratization of warfare, we have a different path that we can take. We can build the capabilities that will allow us to hurt our adversaries in ways that we never could before. Right? And that's what's going on. We're seeing it with the Iranians. We're seeing it with Hezbollah. And that means we're going to see a more unstable region. Like Danny, I think it is going to keep pulling us back for that reason.
That was so very well said. Thank you, Ken. Stephen, I know you got to run in the next few minutes. So before I go to Annie and ask her about partnerships, I'm just going to give you the floor to talk about whatever you want. Final words from you. I know you got to run in the next 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, and Danny alluded to it, and I think it's a very important point, is that there is another front, another active front at this moment, and that is Lebanon. And Ken talked about it as well. And I think that the fact that the U.S. negotiators have allowed Lebanon to be part of this conversation is extraordinarily irresponsible, to be completely honest with you. You have an Israeli government and a Lebanese government that actually agree that Hezbollah should be disarmed. We can argue from today until tomorrow about whether the Lebanese government has the will, the desire, et cetera, but they actually agree. And essentially, U.S. negotiators have given, are trying to give, and seems like successfully giving Hezbollah the ability to live and fight another day. And I think that is just asking for a replay of the dynamics that we've had in the Levant for decades now. It seems to me, for better or worse, the Israelis have discovered since October 7th that their policies that they joined with in the United States in the 1990s did not serve them well. And therefore, they are trying to reverse aspects of them. Yet, U.S. negotiators are trying to reestablish some of these parameters where we have this kind of deterrence between Hezbollah and Israel, which will end up just costing more Lebanese lives, because the post-October 7th view of the Israelis is kill or be killed. It's not actually mowing the lawn. It's constant gardening. And it's brutal gardening at that. It is ripping things out. And I think that is prolonging the agony of the Lebanese people. And I think it's very short-sighted on the part of U.S. negotiators. I would love to continue this conversation. I have another meeting that I am responsible for. But it's been great to be here with Danny and Ken and Annie. And of course, you, Bilal. Thank you again for the invitation. And I'd love to come back soon and continue on this topic or a variety of other topics that we are not going to run out of anytime in the near future.
You've got a reserved spot. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your contributions.
Bye-bye.
Good luck with your meeting.
Thanks.
Annie, spent 15 years in the Pentagon, probably too many Subway sandwich lunches and Panda Express, but you have worked with all of our partners in the Middle East and you understand the value of partnerships. Obviously, we have been wanting to do less in that part of the world and ask our partners to step up. Just a couple of days ago, you and I were in the same workshop discussing this very issue and sort of struggling with the idea of how do we stop creating dependencies, which we are still doing, by the way, while helping them out, develop military effectiveness and things where that could be quite helpful for U.S. policy in the Middle East. So, do you feel like we are getting more serious about the very concept of partnership? I know that CENTCOM does it better than anybody, and they think about this night and day, especially in this operating environment. But just generally speaking, as policy, as strategy, are we getting more serious about partnership?
Thank you, Bilal. So I think what we're seeing right now is we're seeing two sort of competing visions in the Middle East that are emerging simultaneously. On the one hand, you have this growing recognition, which this war has made very clear, I think, to everybody, that the threats in the region and the challenges, whether it's the missiles, the drones, terrorism, the proxies, energy security, the challenges of the Strait, technology, economic development, none of these either challenges or opportunities respect national boundaries, and they all have to be dealt with collectively through cooperation between these Gulf and Arab countries. And this is especially true on the security side. It's especially true when it comes to the Strait. And that's been the logic behind the Abraham Accords, but behind IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, between lots of infrastructure initiatives in the region that we've been trying to get off the ground. It's the logic behind so many of the business and civil society partnerships that we work on at AJC's Center for a New Middle East. And on the security side, as you point out, that's the logic behind CENTCOM's efforts to build a more integrated regional security architecture, bringing different countries together to be able to work on these security challenges, of course, which most of the time, right, there's a few outliers, but most of the time they come down to Iran and things that Iran is doing throughout the region that threaten all of the other countries in the region. But on the other hand, on the other side, we're seeing these new geopolitical fractures emerging in the region. We're seeing a lack of trust. We're seeing these competing ambitions among some of the different Gulf partners. We're seeing ideological fractures. We're seeing a variety of different challenges. And I think of it a little bit as almost one of these game theory problems. I think we all learned in some college seminar about the prisoner's dilemma, where you have each of these partners wants what's best for their security. And there's such incentive. They know that the way forward is working collectively together. But there's this problem where everyone's out for themselves and there's a lack of trust, right? And there's a lack of leadership. And so they have to look out for themselves first, especially in this environment. So there's a sort of an acknowledgement that you're not going to get to a solution with these key problems. If you're sort of working by yourself, or if you're not working collectively across the GCC and across the Arab world. And I think, fragmentation, it doesn't serve America's interests. It doesn't serve the interests of the region, and it doesn't serve the interests of these individual countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or the UAE. It doesn't improve security. It doesn't attract investment, strengthen economic resilience, or create the commercial environment that these countries want for their future. So it's a real problem. And Israel, you asked about partnerships. On the security side, I would also just want to say that I think Ken is absolutely right about the democratization of warfare when it comes to the offensive challenges and everything that the Iranians and their proxies have been able to do to attack across the region. But on the defensive side, the actual technology and the knowledge and having solutions that have been battle tested and actually used, there's a discrete and limited number of partners who actually understand how this stuff works and are able to implement things like counter-drone warfare, integrated air and missile defense. It's the Ukrainians, it's the Israelis, and it's the United States. In terms of the countries that have actually operated this stuff and had to fight these sort of defensive challenges that the Gulf countries are really trying to master right now. And so when we look at solutions, I think those countries are all critical in terms of actually being able to provide the solutions that these countries want and need. And, Israel can provide solutions both on the security side, but also in terms of food security, in terms of water security, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of broader resilience, given how Israel has dealt with a lot of these threats for years now. But what's going to be the determining factor? Because I don't believe that integration and this cooperation is inevitable. We don't see it. It isn't inevitable. And so it really relies on leadership and the United States leadership, frankly, because we are one partner that these different countries, to varying degrees, but they all have a degree of trust with the United States. They have established relationships. I think that trust is still to some degree there, but they want to be reassured. They want to know that we remain engaged, that we remain committed. That's not about necessarily the number of combat troops in the region, but although I do think that force posture matters. And I actually wrote a piece recently on my Times of Israel blog talking about ways in which I think the United States can continue to really, and it makes sort of an unpopular argument, I'll say, arguing that actually somewhat counterintuitively, now is a moment where we need to actually double down. And not in terms necessarily, I'm not necessarily in the same place as Danny in terms of doubling down on our military operations, but doubling down in terms of our demonstrations of commitment to the region, right. Whether that is, rebuilding our bases and force posture in a way that makes sense for us and for our partners, bringing back our diplomats and ambassadors in all of our embassies, and really demonstrating strong solidarity and staying power. I think that's more important now than ever, and it's a question. Can we use those tools in a way that sort of helps move our partners forward in the way that they really want to move forward in the region?
Thank you, Annie, for a terrific set of comments. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience, and believe it or not, I see 28 of them, but we're not going to take all of them. Don't worry. I've chosen maybe 4 or 5 just from different locations. So I will, I don't think any of them really specified who would like to answer them. So maybe I'll choose myself. But I want to leave the last few moments also for Shamma, to provide also closing remarks, and then we can wrap it up. So the first one I actually really like, and maybe I can send that to you, Danny. Can you think, and this is from Bahrain, can you think of a scenario or an attack that could completely derail the talks? I mean, you saw what happened last night with Kuwait, which was pretty scary, and also the attack on the Fifth Fleet headquarters. But just in your mind, can you envision something far worse that could really make things go awry?
That's a question that I probably would have answered differently last week and probably differently the week before that, because I would have expected that the president would have declared the ceasefire over when, the ceasefire was, how should I put this, over. But he didn't. I suspect that if they kill an American, which, given their targeting, given their efforts, is a distinct possibility, that he will then be forced to respond. The question is, will he restart military operations, and in a serious way, not in a defensive? And for those of us who follow CENTCOM's incredibly anodyne press releases, they're always saying defensive, responding to. So, beyond that, I think it would need to be something of that scale. I do think the president is positioning himself to sit around and watch the Iranians suffer for a while, or at least in his perception, suffer for a while. They yesterday's or 2 days ago sanctioned the Persian Gulf, authority that is taking the money, the quote unquote tolls, and put in place a bunch of financial sanctions against them. So, he's clearly not giving up, but what it would take to push him over the edge, yeah, that's my guess, but even that may not be enough.
Right. Okay. And I mean, we've seen it before also, obviously, with the killing of an American contractor, which may or may not have led to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, right? Okay. Ken, this is from Riyadh, and I think you are well positioned to answer it. So obviously, we all know that Hezbollah matters to Iran, but the question here is, how much does it matter in this particular instance? Does it matter more than the Strait? Obviously not. Does it matter more than the nuclear program? Because they seem to be making a pretty strong case that it matters a ton, to the point of threatening to suspend or even stop talks with the Americans. I think the question is trying to get at here, if they do get a good deal from the Americans that doesn't include a ceasefire or advantageous, position for Hezbollah in Lebanon, would they actually let it go?
Yeah, so it is an interesting question, Bilal, and obviously we need to be careful here because the Iranians are a famously fragmented polity, and as we've all been pointing out, not entirely clear who's running the show in Tehran, not entirely clear what the divisions are there. Okay. With those caveats in mind, I think you're absolutely right. There's no question that Hezbollah is probably not as important to the Iranians as the Strait of Hormuz. I think that they are unquestionably more important to Iran than the nuclear program. Right? We should be recognized they were willing to make massive concessions, major concessions on their nuclear program back in 2015, not interested in making concessions on Hezbollah. Now, Danny would doubtless point out that Barack Obama didn't ask them to make concessions on Hezbollah. That's a true statement. But I also suspect that they would have refused to do so, in part because Hezbollah was, in many ways, a more effective and useful deterrent than the potential of their nuclear program. Right? They made the calculation that they could give that away and still maintain their own deterrent capabilities and Hezbollah's as part of it. All that said, I don't think that the Iranians are necessarily rank ordering their, these priorities in that way. And most dangerous of all, as I think we've all been pointing out, is right now they seem to believe that they may be able to have all of these priorities, right? That they may be able to keep their, their cake and eat it too. As Stephen pointed out at the very top of the session. Right now, they seem like they are in the driver's seat. Danny made this point as well. They believe that they have the advantage and that they're going to be able to hang on longer than President Trump. That's a very dangerous situation for all of us. And, again, Danny alluded to this. They're terrible negotiators. They believe that they're the greatest negotiators in the world. They're actually the worst negotiators in the world. And they will push this way beyond any actual equilibrium point. That's something else we should keep in mind as we think about how this is going to end.
Fair enough. Thank you, Ken. I think I'll take two more and then we could wrap it up. Annie, maybe I can throw this one to you. This is interesting. Can the Gulf states afford going on the offensive? I mean, they've tried the accommodation route. That didn't work. Engagement and all that sort of stuff. But there's certainly risks to, military action. So they kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. What are your thoughts on that?
The Gulf states literally are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Pardon the pun. I think that, on the one hand, at this stage, they've already been attacked. But I think if they go on the offensive publicly, hitting Iran, the retaliation against critical infrastructure is going to be so severe that it puts them in a very tough place. I think there is the potential for a lot of coordination quietly, things happening behind the scenes, cooperation with the United States. I don't think we're going to see, and I think this gets back as well to the issue of cooperation and trust that I alluded to earlier, that these countries, to the degree to which they're having conversations about offensive action, it's happening very quietly and discreetly through CENTCOM, and there's a very strong desire not to get their finger pointed at publicly.
Yes. And they're obviously not in the same boat. There are important differences in approaches to this conflict.
Exactly. And they're not getting hit in the same level. I mean, we have seen the UAE, and Bahrain have been targeted, and Kuwait as well. Some countries have been targeted much more than others, and which I think also is partly feeds into this attitude of distrust and the fact that they're not all swimming in the same direction. They're trying various different diplomatic approaches with Iran, with other countries in the region. And so that makes it hard for the sort of cooperation that they would need to be doing a united public front.
Thank you, Annie. Danny, someone in Singapore is not very happy with the Houthis, or at least worried about them. The question is, walk us through another nightmare scenario, Bab el-Mandeb. Should we worry about that? Go.
Someone in Singapore is concerned about the Houthis?
Don't ask me.
Not in the Gulf, huh?
No, I'm pretty sure there's worry in the Gulf too, but that's the question that I saw.
Not in London.
Yeah.
Look, the Houthis have been a very interesting example of, the dog that didn't bark, because they were an opportunity for the Iranians to make the conflict, to add a front to the conflict. And apart from a couple of desultory missiles towards Israel, they haven't really done very much. I suspect that's a testament to Saudi efforts at diplomacy. That's what we call it now, right? Bribery, diplomacy. But again, you're not buying anybody in the region. You're only renting them. And so do the Houthis retain the option to put the Bab el-Mandeb in play again? For sure they do. And I'll add something for Singapore. This is all a huge lesson to us about the Strait of Malacca, right? This is leverage that, while we have put thought into it, I would say our Asia colleagues probably much more than we have historically, because many of us thought, the Iranians will never do that in the Strait of Hormuz. There are alternatives to the Bab el-Mandeb. But the reality is that, particularly given the risk aversion of shipping agencies, of insurance and reinsurance and all of the above, this is something we need to think about a lot more, because what we have demonstrated to the world now, what the Iranians have demonstrated to the world is they can use what to them had felt like a nuclear option and just sort of regularize it. And everybody will put up with it. And we have put up with it, right? So, does that mean rethinking global shipping? Does that mean building lots and lots of new pipelines which have their own vulnerabilities? All of those are questions that, frankly, I haven't seen aggressively contemplated, and will be very interesting.
Fair enough. Shema, you've been incredibly patient. I promise you this is the last question. Only because I'm really personally very much interested in this. Ken, this is from Kiev to Dr. Ken Pollack. Where do you see Ukraine playing a role in this conflict?
So I think Ukraine has been playing a very helpful role in terms of reaching out to America's allies and offering assistance for a problem that they have faced and dealt with better than arguably any other country on earth. I think it's been absolutely fantastic. And, from my perspective, again, I'm very concerned about how this war ends. I agree with all my colleagues that it ain't over yet. And, things could really turn around. Wars are inherently predictable. But, if nothing else, I think one of the really great things that may come of this is greater cooperation between Ukraine and the Gulf states, and potentially Gulf funding for the Ukrainian war effort, which would also be fantastic.
So maybe especially on the counter-drone stuff?
Yeah, exactly. And if that gets the Gulf to then put money into Ukraine to help them with their defensive needs against Russia, win-win.
Well, watch my opinion in the Financial Times tomorrow on this very issue. All right, Shama, the floor is yours, my friend. Thank you for your patience.
Hi, Ben. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being with us here today. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude this in-depth strategic dialogue on the war in the Middle East and the US policy amid escalating regional tensions, I think it becomes clear that we are witnessing a pivotal moment whose implication, I'd say, they extend far beyond the region itself. What is unfolding today is no longer simply another cycle of regional tension, but rather it is a reflection of deeper structural changes in the nature of conflict, the limits of power, and even the ways regional and international crises are managed. One of the most significant conclusions emerging from this discussion, I'd say, is that traditional approaches to managing Middle Eastern crisis, they're no longer sufficient to fully understand the dynamics of the current landscape or even contain its consequences. Today's crisis, it extends well beyond conventional geopolitics, encompassing cybersecurity, supply chains, energy security, maritime routes, and information warfare as well. So this reality, it demands a rethinking of both analytical frameworks and even policy approaches. The Middle East today stands at a historic crossroad. The current crisis could either become a catalyst for building a more stable and balanced regional order, or it could lead to continued cycles of escalation that drain the resources and resilience of both states and societies. So I think from this perspective, the importance of intellectual and strategic dialogues, such as those, for example, organized by Trends Group, they lie in their ability to provide a vital platform for deeper understanding, the exchange of perspectives, and also the exploration of future scenarios in a world undergoing unprecedented transformation. So thank you all for your participation and valuable contributions, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.
Amen to that. Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Danny. We'll see you guys soon.
Thank you so much, Bilal.
Thanks, B.